Well, I think it's important to understand that in my talk, I talked about the fact that the largest and most visible environmental campaign, I think, ever in the history of mankind, was this tar sands campaign that I've been a part of for quite, since it began, is very much like many of our impacted communities. The leadership is really women. And whether it's in northern Cheyenne in Montana, or whether it's in on the North Slope in Point Hope, or Barrow, Alaska, or Arctic Village, or whether it's in Denida up in the Northwest Territories, or wherever, or deep in the Amazon rainforest. Every place that I've ever worked as a campaigner, it always starts with a group of women, and and eventually the men come around once everything's been laid out and there's very clear instruction, and now as a young man that comes from Cree culture, that's my nation, we're matrilineal, and so it's very culturally normal, and I was raised in a certain way by my mother, who was a single mother, and all her sisters who she took in, to just be very comfortable with the traditional role that that men have in our society, which is to do what, not, well, it sounds rude, but to do what you're told, by the leadership, the matriarch. And the interesting thing for me, like I said, over the years, as far as the environmental justice movement goes, while gender issues are still a major issue, and particularly patriarchy, like in how it plays out, and it's its own thing too, because the way that a Cree man deals with patriarchy versus the way even a white woman deals with patriarchy, there's some pretty complex levels there. And I think Bell Hooks unpacks it quite well. But as far as Idle No More, it was founded by our women, three Cree women and a non-native woman, which is pretty significant. And I think that for us internally in our communities and in our political structures in Canada, we've been dealing with the old boys club, and a lot of our traditional governance in many of our diverse nations. And you have to remember that Native people, the only similarities we have are that we're brown, susceptible to diabetes, and we all have a connection to the sacredness of Mother Earth. But aside from that, culturally and politically, socially, spiritually, we're like Chinese to Polish. Like, it's very different. And it's colonial implants that kind of have made us Indians, all one group. But within all of that complexity, there's been a significant issue with our Indian Act or Bureau of Indian Affairs chairmen and council governments, colonial government structures, because they did not have any mechanism, especially for the matrilineal nations, to honor the traditional leadership role of women in our society. But I see a resurgence. There's a cultural revolution that's taking place in Canada, and it's sprouting up in specific areas in the United States in what we call Indian country. And it's a very exciting thing because, again, the leadership is coming from women. There's the kind of bread and butter political organizations, the chiefs organizations, are kind of scared, like they don't know what to do with it. So they're endorsing, and but at some point there will be a convergence piece, and where we'll have to eventually deal with this kind of Western patriarchal influence within our social movement, within our political structures. And I think that that's all part of a long-term decolonization process that, quite frankly, is rooted deeply in education, but also, our ceremonies and everything else. I would throw back, just before we jump to the other question, I really wanted to ask you too on what are your perspectives on the tensions between, Western liberal feminist movement and what I've grown to learn about with the indigenous feminist movement, which is a bit different. It's about reasserting the power and role of women within the context of governance versus like this kind of different thing that happened in the regular feminist movement in America, I think. I'm not very educated on it though, but I've encountered the dynamics, and a lot of the Native women I work with get really angry at the white liberal feminist narrative, and I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that, given your work in the Middle East, because I know a lot of the allies I work with in that community get real pissed off in the same way too, about assumptions about like the burqa and all that stuff. I don't know.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm hooked up here. I don't need this thing. So I don't know. I don't know much about the history. I maybe can talk a little bit more about some. And I don't know much about Africa in general. I can say a little bit about Kenya and maybe speculate a little bit about some other places. But let me start with the idea of structural adjustment. As I say, I've not studied that at all, but I would break that out into several components. And I think there are a lot of elements of things that go under structural adjustment that had a lot of positive consequences, which may sound surprising, but let me just explain why I feel that way. And I think there are probably a lot that had bad consequences as well. But one element of this is liberalizing trade, and another element of this is getting rid of some state-owned enterprises. I felt like a lot of the people who are employed in state-owned enterprises are far better off than the average Kenyan. And in fact, they're being subsidized at the expense of the average Kenyan. And I think a lot of the protected industries in Kenya, also the people who worked in those industries are far better off than the average Kenyan, and were being supported at the expense of the average Kenyan. So let me give you an example of this. Take Kenya right now has, when I last went to Kenya, I flew from Thailand actually, and the flight was coming from, it had originated in China, and it was full of people, it was full of Kenyans who were going to China to trade, and of Chinese who were coming to Kenya to work on various projects, some of them trading, but I think a lot in road construction. So I think that there's a very different type of set of people than is on flights when I normally fly from via Europe. And there it tends to be much more elite, both foreigners and Kenyans who are on the flight. And I think this trade is opening up all sorts of opportunities for regular Kenyans that would not have been possible if trade were cut off. So, for example, there are a lot of Kenyans who are running in the town where I work. There are a lot of Kenyans who have various taxi businesses. Some of them on bicycle taxis, some of them on motorcycle taxis. These help some people make a living and help other people get around. That would be impossible. Then that would be impossible without fair trade, because the bicycles and the motorbikes they're using are imported from places where it's much cheaper to produce them. So than it is in Kenya. And so I think that greater accessibility, the greater transport, and the greater income earning opportunities from that type of trade liberalization that make bicycles and motorcycles accessible to more people. There's some downsides of that. As you see, lots of traffic accidents in Kenya. But I think overall, I think it's probably a good thing. On the cuts on health and education, so I don't know the details of that, but I certainly think that there was often an assumption that you could cut health and cut education and tell people to pay and there'd be no costs. And I think that was, as I said earlier, I don't think that that's the case. But even within health and education, I would really distinguish by sector. So if you're talking about tertiary hospitals, which was where I think a lot of the money was going, or tertiary education, these are things that are really helping the elite within Kenya. I feel like there's a lot of very positive, I mean, Kenyan politics is very complicated and there are a lot of not so nice things that happen, but I think democracy is, there's been a real change in the politicians now have to appeal to the population. And one way to appeal to the population is, free primary education came in around the same time that elections got very competitive. And I think that's perhaps the free primary, I don't think the donors were necessarily pushing for it, but I think the fact that I think it really came from democracy, and I think that's a great thing. And another thing that's come in recently is free maternal care. And again, I think this was seen as a winning election slogan, and that's a positive. There are other things that are coming in. The president's saying he's going to give out laptops and I think he's going to do it to all first graders. That, to me, is not an effective use of resources.
First graders?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a terrible use of resources. There's so many other more pressing needs. But I guess I think that some of the recent developments come from possibly the changing. Well, I think the increase in democracy, which the international situation may have facilitated, has produced some very positive results on education and health. So.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful meme on Facebook and Twitter that I always see, and it just on the question of the impact of some of the structural adjustments and just the whole poverty thing, and not just Africa but everywhere. I mean, we have it too in First Nations, the narrative, But I just want to bring it in for the humor. Is it's this picture of these beautiful African youth, and it says, "Every minute in Africa, another minute passes." And they're like, anyway, I just wanted to put that out there. So.
Well, the liberalized trade, of course, this is a very complex subject, and it could be a very lengthy subject too, but there is something to be said for protecting domestic industries. But of course, that is a complex and complicated subject. But I suppose I should respond to the query that Clayton posed to me.
Before you do, though, on that topic which you're asking him, as far as, the legacy of dependency, I think, that you're referring to, in terms of the retraction of domestic investment in like critical social services, and just kind of passing the buck. I think that fundamentally is kind of the problem with that kind of colonial relationship, and whose version of democracy are we talking about, and for what political and economic objective. And quite frankly, I think that a lot of the structural adjustments, not just in Africa, but all over the planet, are being driven by private sector Western influences that, want to wrestle away, nationalize control over these entities and put it in the private sector. And they want to eliminate the barriers. And, they don't mind having the dependency piece completely built into that as well. I don't know, I just put that out there. I'm not an expert on that area at all, but I did want to put that out there as well, that it's, to me, it's not a flaw that your question is describing. To me, I think that's how it was designed, to create more dependency on the IMF or World Bank or whatever loaning mechanism it is, I mean, who gives the money to these institutions? G8 countries. And they create the dependency, and they provide financial mechanisms for, economic expansion nationally in their northern region. It's working great.
And of course, you're working in Kenya, so I remember, of course, I was a graduate student in the 1980s, and then working for the UN in the 1990s, and I remember being a little taken aback by the World Bank emphasis on primary education to the detriment of tertiary education. Now, not to say that these are mutually exclusive, but to point out that investments in tertiary education is absolutely necessary in order to build skills and a knowledge base and human capital in that country in order to avoid the dependency on experts from other parts of the world. And I think that that was one of the tragedies, unfortunately, of structural adjustment. By taking funding away from tertiary education, you were actually depleting some of these countries and some of the poorest countries of an educated population, and then simply exacerbating dependence on foreign experts. So in the poorest countries, the most peripheral countries, you basically had experts coming in from different international organizations in different parts of the world, highly paid consultants, highly paid NGO staff members, and so on, to basically tell these countries how to run their economies, how to run their school systems, how to run their health services, and so on. And I think this was one of the downsides, I think, of the structural adjustment policies and taking the funding away from certain social sectors. But that's, again, it's a debate, and I don't know if you see those effects of Kenya today.
So again, I don't study higher education at all. I've studied a little bit in the U.S. So I can just give you casual impressions. So I totally agree. There's a huge issue of foreign consultants who are paid a lot of money, and they're typically paid a lot of money by foreign organizations. So I think one thing that would be really good is if the donor organizations stopped paying so many foreign consultants and put much more of the money directly into programs. Right. And the reason they pay the consultant, in my view, one of the reasons they pay the consultant, there are many reasons, a lot of political economy behind it, but one of the many reasons they pay the consultant so much is this idea that they have to pretend that projects are going to be sustainable. And I think it'd be much better to say, no, so I would, in general, I think we'll just pay indefinitely for everybody to be vaccinated, for women to be able to give birth and have medical care when they're giving birth, and many other examples. On the tertiary education versus primary education issue, look, I'd love to see resources for all of these things, and I think there's a very strong case for, I think there's a very strong case for income redistribution domestically and globally. And I don't want to say redistribution because that implies that there's something legitimate about the existing distribution, which I don't think there is. I think every citizen of the world should have a certain amount of income. So I would be in favor of that. But I think that the problem is I have a little bit more sympathy for the people who put a lot of emphasis on primary education and drew a contrast with tertiary, because I don't think those were the people necessarily in charge of the total resource flows for education. If you're within the education ministry and you've got a fixed budget and you have to think about where do I cut back, I'm not necessarily saying that Kenya was a society where the people in university, when I first taught high school in Kenya, university students were paid to attend college. So not only was it free, but they were paid, and they were paid a salary that was way more than the average, the average farmer would earn. I mean, hugely more. I won't say infinitely more, obviously not. That's not very precise. But and meanwhile, people had to pay to go to secondary school, and large amounts, and they had to pay to go to primary school. Well, I would rather say that primary school is free, and for tertiary, you have to borrow and then pay back with the income, or at least saying maybe you don't have to borrow, but at least you don't get paid to go. The big thing I see going on in Kenya now, which I think is going on in many other countries, it's just anecdotally, is in terms of higher education, is huge, booming private sector higher education.
Right.
Hugely booming. I think that's going on a lot of developing countries. It seems something very much worth studying, but I don't know of any good papers on it.
I want to make sure that we come back to Clayton's question to you, but since it's on the same theme, this is going to oversimplify a lot, but one way to think about some of the differences in the talks is to say that, Val and Clayton, you put more emphasis, relatively speaking, on international treaties or treaties and social movements, right? The kind of combination of those two things, whereas Michael, you put more emphasis on, I guess, in some ways, studies of populations and the effect that they can have on national legislation.
Oh, no.
Maybe I'm
That's just what I do for a living.
Right.
That's not what's important. I don't have any illusions about that. I think we can sometimes do things at the margin, but I don't want to, no, I mean, I think I think
that in other ways, but I guess so the question I'm having, so I don't want to mischaracterize your position either, but, I would say you're in the realm, by virtue of being an economist, of having more discussions about market mechanisms and, appropriate national legislation. And you talked a little bit less, relatively speaking, about kind of local social movements, international treaties, right? You talked about international NGOs, but less about local NGOs and international treaties. And you guys talked less about kind of markets and those sorts of things. Do you see, are there ways in which you would want to say, look, there is a clear role for, local NGOs and international treaties in the stuff that I'm looking at in terms of improving healthcare? Or is that just less important in your view? And would you want to say that there's really an important role for market mechanisms in solving some of the kinds of challenges that you're looking at? So that's oversimplifying a little bit, but it's designed to kind of push you to, in my mind, clarify, like, well, what's most important here, and is there equal room for these other things, or not? No.
Well, people are talking about these public-private partnerships now in development studies and across different domains. And I've always felt that if public funding will produce skilled workers and educated people who will then staff particular corporations and industries and so on, then the private sector is partially responsible for funding public education. That would be one, I think, very constructive and positive way of implementing a public-private partnership in certain developing countries. And I think the same would be with healthcare as well. If, again, governments are going to be responsible for providing healthy citizens to work in particular industries and sectors, then that private sector should also help to finance some of these social rights like, healthcare and so on. There are these conversations that are, occurring in international development circles about this sort of thing. That would be my 2 cents worth.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think that when we talk about things at a macro level, at a major, kind of geopolitical level, international development, my reaction in the school of thought that I come from is often that we should always support the local NGOs first and foremost, and that they should be the ones leading. There was a funny story from Kenya I heard about a local NGO who was taking all this money from this big international development agency to do a bunch of tomato plant cropping on the side of a river in Kenya. And when the plants were just about ready to go, everybody in the camp was like, oh my God, run! Because a bunch of hippos came out of the river and ate everything. And then all the international development people were like, well, shit, we gave you all this money to grow all this food. Why did you do it by the river when you knew the hippos would come once it was ready? And they're like, because you gave us the money. And we had some other stuff we had to do. And so, it was an Italian NGO, which is ironic because they're growing tomatoes. And the hippos went wild for them.
With the pasta sauce.
But I'm just saying, though, the point I'm trying to make, though, is that I think quite often, and I understand the, accountability, transparency, and all of these pieces, but I think that far too often international development organizations end up contributing much more to Western colonialism around the world in different regions, whether it's Southeast Asia, whether it's in Africa, and in Kenya in particular. I mean, if you look at the Maasai, here you have an impoverished indigenous community whose culture and practice, of animal husbandry and all these things have been decimated by the current global economic paradigm, and now they're being courted by the World Bank, to buy into this reducing emissions through deforestation and degradation program called REDS, which is going to privatize forested lands in Kenya and pay indigenous peoples to take care of them, take care of the lands that you've always lived in, and reforest new forests, and we'll pay you to do it. But what they leave out is that, actually, those forests will probably be monocrops, they'll be genetically modified trees, palm oil plantations, all mechanisms aimed at providing biofuels to the international biofuel market, or to be commodities to be bought, sold, and traded on the World Bank's carbon trading facility, so that the investors in the World Bank, like the United States, can have a financial mechanism to expand their fossil fuel industries here in North America, and to say, oh, look, we did this clean development mechanism or this thing down in the global south, and we planted 1 million palm oil trees, and we solved poverty. We paid a bunch of forest dwellers to keep dwelling in the forest, and I'm sorry to come off like that, but it's very complex and intense. But the point I'm trying to make is that quite often a lot of these schemes end up just really furthering colonial agendas. And I think that, I don't know anything though about the immunization thing. Well, I know that it saves lives, I don't know anything about it, but I do know enough that a lot of these schemes end up further marginalizing the groups, and that in Africa, a lot of the fundamental solution there is land reform. From South Africa right to Kenya, you look at who owns the land and who's in the cities. Those people that are in the cities need to be out on the land, and then all the poverty stuff will be solved. So anyway.
I think one of the problems with structural adjustment was that it depleted state capacity in many of the poorest countries. And some of the countries that avoided structural adjustment actually ended up doing pretty well in terms of health outcomes. Iran. Now, its government is not a very nice government. It's a very repressive regime and such, but boy, is that a state with capacity to do what states are supposed to do in terms of delivering literacy, education, and health care, including family planning services, which then resulted in very low fertility rates and so on and so forth, lower than the United States, actually. So that was one of the major problems, I think, also with the structural adjustment policies. And I think that there's some consensus that a lot went wrong with that, and in particular in this depletion of state capacity to do what states are supposed to do, provide these kinds of social services for their citizens. And I think that the poorest countries were the worst affected, actually, by this.
Let me just go back to your question, which is, you're saying I was talking about studies, but
Well,
don't.
I want to make sure I didn't mischaracterize your position, so I feel like you maybe think I did, and that may just be a misunderstanding on my part.
Yeah, I think you were, so I spoke about the results of some studies, and I think maybe you thought that I therefore thought that studies were an important driver of politics, and I think studies have some potential to affect politics, but I think the main drivers of politics, you mentioned two things. One is both of which I think are very relevant. One is the international situation and what the great powers are doing and their influence through various channels, including the World Bank and IMF. And the other is domestic politics and social movements.
Sure.
And if again, I'm not a political scientist, and I'm not a international relations specialist, but I'll give my amateur version of what I see as the main forces shaping Kenyan policy. So I agree that the international, so there was, I think in the context of Cold War competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, there was the U.S. was quite happy to back Kenyatta, the first independent president of Kenya, because he was on the U.S. side, more or less, and so he didn't care very much about democracy within, and internally, the internal politics of Kenya. Kenyatta knew that he could manage to rule so his ethnic group is the largest single ethnic group, comprises about 20% of the population, and politics in Kenya is very heavily influenced by ethnic considerations. So they controlled the state. A lot of resources were directed towards that ethnic group and towards, in a situation without democracy, the peasants had very little power. So the main political threat was from the elites. So a lot of resources went to the elites. That included school teachers, to me they're elites, and health workers, and civil servants, and people working in protected industries. I mean, realize they're not elites relative to Kenyatta, and his cronies were relative to the remaining colonialists, of whom there were a significant number who did own a lot of land. So those are higher level elites, but certainly both of those sets of elites had influence, but the regular peasants had very little influence. So there was and I think the change in the international situation was that the end of US-Soviet competition meant that there was for some strange brief window, there was pressure for democracy externally in Kenya. When I say democracy, you raise questions, what does that mean? Who knows what that means, but it did mean multi-party elections. And so there was multi-party elections, and there have been. I think that's become a true part of Kenyan culture, and that means that you need to, I hate to say this, but I don't think indigenous social movements were a big part of this. I think it was politicians, except insofar as you might want to say indigenous party structures, but politicians just realized there's a winning, in a situation, offering a little bit to the regular population, saying, we'll have free primary education, would get you some votes. And there were some people who voted on non-ethnic lines, or some ethnic groups that were up for grabs that were not allied one side or the other. So that became something that was a winning political strategy, and so these things were made free, and that was an improvement. The donors did impose. They also got rid of a lot of trade restrictions, and they forced that on the Kenyan government. And I think that was in part because it was seen in the interest of the international elites. My own judgment is that this was, on the whole, more positive than not, and that Kenya's now been growing. When I lived there, it had been 20 years of stagnation or more, and it's now growing at 5% a year. And I think lives are improving on the whole because of this. But I think there were lots of awful things, and many of them lots of awful things right now.
So let's unpack that a bit, though, because I think that there fundamentally is the point I was trying to bring up earlier about, what is the goal here, and whose model of democracy and economy are we talking about? Like my colleague, the ecologist David Suzuki, often talks about in his speeches about Bhutan, which is quite an interesting little place because they measure their GDP by happiness. And I do understand, the whole economic analysis from the 90s and early 2000s around contraction and convergence. I also think that, when we look at the ecological piece here, in the context of global climate crisis, and when we kind of see, and I mean, like even, and while I don't want to, I'm always mindful of not trying to spawn xenophobia or xenophobic reactions. The economic machine right now of Chinese state companies and their purchasing of assets in Africa and back in my own home country of Canada. I mean, in the Canadian tar sands, there's $300 billion at play in assets. In a span of 18 months, Sinopec and PetroChina acquired $36 billion in tar sands assets. They bought out Conoco. That's in 18 months, 10% of the second biggest oil deposit on the planet. And I mean, and it's a fundamentally different style of development between these state-owned companies and American development firms and American development interests, because when China says, we'll build you this many roads, we'll build you this hospital, they actually do it. The trade-off is that they get to fly their own workers in, because that's what they're doing in the tar sands now. They're building their own airstrips, and they're going to fly their own workers in, and that's what the bilateral free trade negotiations between Canada and China are all about. There's a investor provision, state investor state provision, just like NAFTA, in the proposed Chinese-Canadian bilateral free trade agreement that'll give China the right to sue, for example, the province of British Columbia if BC stops the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline, which they're referring to as the Energy Asia pipeline, from the tar sands, which is landlocked in Alberta, okay? And so this is particularly problematic because it's a totally different style that, quite frankly, has I don't even know how to wrap my head around it, but it is a big elephant in the room for a lot of people when we look at how development is happening, and when we look at it at all the different layers, because at least for where I'm from, you mentioned this flight with all these workers. Where I'm from in the tar sands, the fastest expanding, where I'm from in Canada, in the tar sands, the fastest part of the workforce that's expanding is foreign temporary workers. And it's built right into this trade negotiation. And it, and again, in 16 months, they acquired 10% of the entire tar sands operation. And so in that, and if their this pipeline doesn't get built, they can then use investor state provisions and secret WTO tribal tribunals to sue the BC taxpayers for loss of profit. And in 99.9% of these tribunals, they always go in favor of the corporation. But the fundamental difference here, though, is that these are not companies that are subject to the same market rules. These are companies owned by the state. There's no CEO on board. There's no shareholders. There's no shareholder meeting to go to and do shareholder activism at. It's fundamentally a different game. And so it's kind of, I haven't wrapped my head around that one. Yeah.
So I'm a little mindful of the time, and I want to make sure that people around the room get a chance to ask questions too. Just in terms of maybe reframing my question, the coda to the title of this symposium is "What can we do?" Right? And so another way to think about, or another way I'm thinking about my question is, do we rely on international treaties? Is that where we push hardest? Do we rely on local organizations? Is that where we push hardest? Do we rely on national politics and democracy and democratization? Is that where we push hardest? Like if we want advances in overcoming global inequalities in different domains, we could say that they're all important, and undoubtedly they all are, but if you're going to focus your resources and push hard to make a change, where do you push hardest? Where do you allocate your resources? So that's maybe another way to kind of frame the question.
Shot at that. Earlier a student had, I think, posed the question to you too about how best to make a difference and so on and so forth. Just at a very practical level, I think it's very good to get some good mentorship from some professors and to try to work on some projects with them, which then you can take out with you as part of your portfolio. As you are either entering the world of employment, whatever that might be, or graduate studies. I think we really need some major rethinking of our development paradigms, of our economic growth paradigms, and of issues of citizen rights as well. I mean, and some of the issues and questions have to be addressed transnationally, like climate and environmental devastation. This has to be addressed. I mean, I know that Clayton, for example, has been emphasizing, Canada and the dreadful Stephen Harper. But I mean, I think this is, I think you would agree too, that this is a global question that has to be dealt with transnationally. And to a certain extent, surely health issues as well. And especially for the poorest countries, because the poorest countries don't have the resources to take care of these issues themselves. I mean, in the Middle East, we have, countries with greater resources, and most of them can or do take care of, health and education and welfare on their own. But we have one or two very poor countries like Yemen, which really, really need outside help and assistance, both technical assistance as well as financial assistance. So some of these issues and questions do have to be addressed transnationally, globally. But every single social change movement or social change process that has taken place has been the result of both internal factors and forces and external factors and forces. And some external factors and forces can be very, very negative, such as wars, bombing, intervention, imposed democracy, so-called democracy through invading a country. But a much more positive international influence or intervention in a particular location where domestic forces are also trying to effect change would be international solidarity, would be these international social movements, international NGOs, and the kind of support and solidarity that they might be providing to local activists. In my field, the global women's rights agenda, these international treaties and such, they provide a kind of normative, ethical framework that local groups actually draw on and refer to and tell their governments that, look, you've signed on to these, now put your money where your mouth is and implement them. You have obligations to implement these treaties and conventions that you have signed on to. Or if you haven't signed on to them, for example, if you can, let's say Iran has not signed on, or the US has not signed on to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, do so and implement the conventions. So this is where sometimes this internal-external divide really doesn't make sense. It's an artifice. And really these two sets of forces and factors really interact and intersect in very meaningful and also effective ways. But we cannot continue our present world and our present systems as they are today. I don't know who has watched the film Elysium. That is the future for us. I mean, if we continue with this dreadful extreme oil drilling, whether it's in the tar sands of Canada or it's in the deep oceans of X, Y, or Z country, if this income inequality and this incredible divide between the rich and poor continues, as it has been in quite a number of countries, we will have something that looks dreadfully like Elysium, with its gated communities, with its spatial, physical segregation, and with the marginalization and extreme impoverishment of most of the world's population. We really need to take these issues extremely seriously, and all of us have a responsibility as citizens of the world. So some of these issues have to be tackled domestically, some of them have to be tackled transnationally and globally, and all of us have a role to play in that.
So I think if you're interested in international, I talked about health because that was the topic that I was assigned, but then do other work on international development, not so much on these macro issues like structural adjustment or trade issues. As I say, I'm an amateur. But I think if you're interested in international development, I would recommend two things. First is get some experience living and working in a developing country. I think if you don't have that, you're likely to go off in very crazy directions. The other thing is get a technical skill. So that technical skill, and in both of these things, what those things are depends on your interests. So obviously, if you're from a developing country, then I think you're much better placed to work on what I think is the probably the single biggest thing, which is domestic, the domestic arrangements they're determined by the national politics in that country. Not to say that other things, work of NGOs and social movements and so on aren't important. But if you're, assuming that most people in this audience are not from developing countries, and then spending time in a developing country and getting a technical skill, and that technical skill that, in my case, I'm an economist. I think there's some technical skills that go with that, but it might be a health skill. Maybe it might be an accounting skill. It might be might be something to do with computer science. Whatever it is that is your is an area where you have an interest and where you feel like you have some enough of a foundation that you can build technical skill in that area.
We didn't really talk about it too much, but one of the things I wanted to say in answering this question about what is the, with limited resources and we're running out of time, what's the best thing we can do? And I'm not saying this to like freak you all out or like make you all feel sad. I promise I'll be positive at the end of what I'm saying here. But migration. You all seen the latest issue of the National Geographic. The whole thing was about rising global sea levels. And it had the Statue of Liberty underwater. This really isn't that far off. We're talking 24 years. We're going to see, right now there's about 14 million refugees on the planet, 17 million if you recognize all the Palestinian people living in diaspora. Even more if you recognize the Circassian people who are now fighting the Sochi Olympics in their homeland. But anyway, the number projected of mass displacement in the next 50 years, just of rising sea levels, is in excess of 117 million people. Now, if you wrap your head around that, right now you talk about social safety nets and social programs that are already stretched to their limit. I mean, we're going to a place that is just, quite frankly, unconceivable with our pitiful human perception. That said, I think that fundamentally, going to what you're asking, what do we do coming out of college? We have to start thinking about things in the context of localizing power in the interest of globalizing justice. So whatever your passion is, whatever you decide to do, it should be something that you feel passionate about, that you feel empowered by, that you feel good about doing, and that gives you fulfillment. But fundamentally, as a youth growing up in the United States, going to school at an elite US school, you have an obligation, a moral imperative to act on your privilege, just on your geographical location. There is a whole dynamic between the global South and even within America, between rural America and urban America, that needs to be dealt with. And I think that whatever the solution is, that we have to look at land reform, the radical redistribution of land and wealth. Bottom line, if people have land and they're allowed to grow their own food and drink out of a river and not have some big oil company or rare earth minerals company poison their stream, things tend to go pretty good. And I think that's a big thing, and I guess the caveat that I'll put on there, or the little piece at the end there, is don't get locked up in this kind of, if you really want to know what you can do, don't go being all like conservation is the key to a lot of this stuff, but don't get all caught up in I buy carbon credits and I have solar panels on my house and all my stuff, I drink a Nalgene bottle. What is it? Actually, it's stainless steel now. It's not Nalgene anymore. It's stainless steel now. And, I wear all Mountain Equipment Co-op gear and I eat Ben & Jerry's, whatever. Don't get caught up in that whole hyper-individualism conservation scene, okay? Because that's a scene of privilege that, quite frankly, most of the people in the world have no access to. Do it, okay? Live your life good, recycle, do all those things. But dedicate a good percentage of your personal time and your career choice and your volunteer time to structural change, okay? And what I mean by that is that, if we can get the US military to stop burning oil, that's going to be pretty freaking cool. as far as climate change. If we can get bunker ships to stop burning bunker oil, one bunker ship on one trip produces the same amount of CO2 as 50,000 cars on the road for a year on one trip. Just one ship in one trip. And, if we can get the U.S. transport fleet to change to electric from diesel, I mean, that is freaking amazing. There's an unlimited amount of structural changes that if we all just work together, we could create some really a meaningful change to kind of open things up a little bit more to other people that right now don't have access. And so, when you're coming from high education, coming from a network of privilege, there's ways to use that to lift everybody up, in a good way. And the question that you need to ask yourself as you go into that path is, am I trying to help people get elevated in a class system? Or am I trying to change the system itself so that we all have equity, And fundamentally, the final point that I'll say is that in going back to this question about feminism that opened this up, ecofeminism, Vandana Shiva talks a lot about the fact that the majority of the food on the planet is grown by women. In my experience across the planet fighting big oil and big coal, all of those local fights are led by women. This concept of sacred feminist creative principle needs to come into economy and politics and social systems. There is a fundamental imbalance between the power of whatever the hell power of man is and that feminine creative principle that needs to come back into the conversation about economy and about politics and about social systems. And until we have that come back into the discourse, and it's coming from indigenous feminist movements, it really is. If you listen to it, it's coming from places like India, where there's amazing women's movements rising up. But it hasn't really broken into the Western kind of media narrative yet. But it's going to happen real soon. And I think that at the core is what's fundamentally going to change things, is if we can usher in an era where there is balance again, and that sacred feminine creative principle. I think Westerners call it the precautionary principle as a planning process. In Indian country, we call it the duh principle. This is a very important thing to consider.
If I can just add, two American women's groups actually that do operate according to that principle and also deploy a kind of progressive type of maternalist politics actually would be Madre, based in New York City, but a transnational network, and also Code Pink, and their activism against Medea and Jody and so on. This would be a good place also for some of you to get some experience with working with organizations like this, because these organizations actually are well known internationally too, in international policy circles. So developing country experience, knowledge of development studies of the way, and also some of these development issues and discourses internationally. A couple of good papers that you write here, whether your senior thesis paper or your capstone paper, and then some good work with some of these good NGOs, or maybe even Peace Corps in one or two developing countries. That will take you a long way.
First of all, when we're talking about oil companies and the oil lobby, okay, it's a fundamentally different conversation than anything else, especially when we're talking about it in the context of market strategies or market campaigns. Like, try and boycott Shell. Go ahead. The way they've structured even their fuel delivery service downstream is they have one non-identified corporation that they all give their finished market-ready fuels to, that will drive around to all the gas stations, and the mix of gas that's put into all of them is one day it's Shell, one day it's BP's stuff, one day it's Exxon from the tar sands. It's and at the end of the year they just calculate it all together, and they're like, okay, here's what we owe each other, and voila, it's all integrated. And it's integrated at such an incredibly high level that your typical kind of checks and balances of holding them accountable don't work. And the best case study for you to take a look at is BP. Like, and I hear what my colleague here is talking about in terms of if they are extracting all this stuff and creating all this, you know, they're creating all these, they're offsetting they're externalizing cost of cleanup and all this on local communities, then damn rights they should pay for education, for healthcare. The problem with that kind of capital force is that they do pay, but they do it in a way that is strategic, that they define, that is voluntary. It is not governed by governments with backbones that hold them accountable and that, you know, make them pay in the way that the people want. They do it in a way that gives them the social license to continue to operate. And the example of what I'm talking about is Tate Modern and the Tate Museum in the United Kingdom. You look at this, it's the most famous museum, an art gallery in the world, right? One of them, one of the top 10. Yeah, top 10. And they, Shell Corporation and BP, they pay millions of dollars in sponsorship every year so that every person from the world can go to Tate Modern or to the Tate galleries for free. And Shell, BP all over everything. And they do this strategically in impacted communities. They buy schools, so you'll see the Shell School or the Shell Clinic and it gives social license. And so it's a real challenging thing when you get into these global compacts that are out there where private sector and governments and civil society are coming together, because these companies are operating at an entirely different level than any other private sector interest. Like mining companies are like lice on the big dog that is big oil. Like seriously, even Rio Tinto is like, it's a flea compared to Exxon, like as far as capital, okay? That's why anytime big oil goes in anywhere, you get all these little lice that fall off, and those are the mining companies and the forestry companies, and they come in on the roads that big oil pays for, you know? And so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that when you look at, if we leave it up to voluntary systems, okay, and these compacts, these global compacts are left voluntary and not legally binding, they'll never work. Okay, we need governments to take back the democracy from big oil. We need a separation of oil and state. Bottom. It sounds like a joke, but I'm dead serious. It's funny, you know, but this is like at the level of church and state during colonial expansion. That's how ingrained big oil is into political structures now, you know, and not just in America. I mean, even in China, you know, PetroChina is now going to war with the government because it's become, it's turned into this beast, you know, like where even the government can't control it now because of the nature of it, you know, like the corporate power, capital, you know, and so I just wanted to put that out there. The BP case study is a good one to look at. When Sir Brown took over BP and said, we're going to go beyond petroleum. They spent more money on the brand change from BP to Beyond Petroleum globally than the entire planet had spent on renewable energy resources at the time. And so, like, and they did nothing. And then, you know, Sir Brown got taken out, and the new guy, you know, Tony, what's-his-lips, came in and took the company right back to black, you know, right back to big oil. And then we got the Gulf Coast disaster. So leaving it in a voluntary framework, no good. Legally binding mechanisms to phase out fossil fuel development, good. Getting big, oh, sorry.
That's okay. No, I was just going to say, so you're saying you're quite hopeful about corporate-state partnerships? If I've understood you correctly.
I'm hopeful about about what's happening in Bolivia and Ecuador. The rights of Mother Earth piece in Bolivia under the Morales government, and the pay to keep the oil in the ground model, the Asuni model in Ecuador. These are incredible models that, quite frankly, keep it in the public sphere, and for private sector to come in, they have to agree to legally binding mechanisms. But but no voluntary BS. And so,
Thanks.
Well, you know, from Marx and Engels, we learned that the state in capitalist society is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. And quite frankly, after what happened in the United States after 2007, 2008, it seemed to confirm, frankly, what Marx and Engels said. And then feminists, of course, many feminists have argued that the state is a patriarchal state. So what can we do? We can say, of course, that you've got a capitalist state, you know, the state of the business class, the state is the state of these male patriarchs. Okay, let's just give up and forget about change. Or, for example, if the only change that can come about is through revolution. But it's not just that, even though I happen to subscribe to both of those lines of inquiry. There's more to the state than that. Weber, for example, Max Weber, the great sociologist, also told us that the state is comprised of certain institutions and agencies and such, and it's there where activism and advocacy can make a difference. Meanwhile, the state also is supposed to be, and claims that it is, in, for example, its constitutions, the state of all its citizens, not just the state of the business class, not just the state of male patriarchs. And meanwhile, the state also signs on to these international conventions, which means that the state has an obligation to implement what it signs on to: human rights, civil rights, political rights, social rights, environmental protection, etc. This creates the space for advocacy, activism, and possibilities for real social change. So while there's absolute truth to the Marxist feminist, perception of the state, it is also true that there is room for advocacy and activism, and there's a lot of real evidence that that has made a difference. And so I don't think that it's entirely true that public-private have been completely fused and completely obliterated. That is to say, the divide between them. There is some room in the interstices for advocacy, for activism, and for change.
Let me see two things. One, so I think there is a lot of, corporate state involvement is very pernicious, I'm also extremely skeptical of voluntary things that corporations do. I'm not a big fan of public-private partnerships because I think they usually, the scenario you were suggesting of where the private is paying for some state functions, I'm for that, totally for that. But let's do it through taxes. That's just make them pay their taxes. But I think often they wind up being actually the corporations grabbing state money and getting the state to do what they want the state to do, and getting lots of credit for it. One thing, though, that I'm just totally, this whole conversation is, totally unlike any conversation that I ever engage in my professional capacity. I just have to say, you guys are like far, far, far to the left of me, and I'm far, far, far to the left of people that I normally talk to. And I just, I think, I don't know what, I guess if you organize something next year, it might make sense to think about other, having a broader group of people, because I feel like this conversation is a sort of, in some ways, a very, it's a very particular set of people that you've got here, and I think it's great that, I've enjoyed, I find this valuable because I don't normally have these conversations, but I think it'd be good to, further broaden it out. Just on that, I feel like there's been a lot of pessimism here. My perspective is that life in the developing world is getting infinitely better. I mean, it's hugely better for so many people. I think I was born in 1964. I think about what life was like in 1964 in India or China and what it's like now, and there's just no comparison. If I think about the average levels of education in Kenya, or life expectancy or infant mortality, it's so much better. And I think those things are it's very easy not, I agree with the problems of inequality are terrible. They're getting worse within countries, although I think they're getting much better across countries. So I guess those things, I think if you take a very big picture look at things, there's a lot of things that are getting better as well. And obviously within U.S. society, there are a lot of dimensions of improvement since 1964.
Okay, well, we've asked a lot of our speakers, and they've given us a lot to think about and to reflect on. So help me thank them for coming to Middlebury College. Thank you.
Awesome.